power, rage, silence. The world misunderstands all three. They hear noise and call it strength. They see movement and call it progress. They hear laughter and believe it means peace. But you, yes, you learned differently. You saw through the surface of illusion. You sat in silence while they mocked you, overlooked you, doubted you, and misunderstood everything you were becoming. They called your quietness weakness. They saw your retreat as surrender. They heard your stillness and believed you were broken. But the truth? You were never broken. You were becoming. You were shaping something in the dark, something irreversible, something permanent. You didn't scream for attention. You didn't beg for validation. You didn't fight in the way they expected. Number. You turned your pain inward and forged it into something far more terrifying. Resolve. You looked at the world and chose not to yell back. You chose not to play by their rules. You chose to go deeper, go darker, go quieter. That silence they laughed at, that silence they dismissed, that silence became your shield, your weapon, your sanctuary. And in that silence, something woke up. Not the broken part of you, not the afraid part of you. Number, the real part, the ruthless part, the permanent part. They say time heals, but not for you. Time didn't heal. Time sculpted. Time sharpened. Time stripped away every illusion until you stood alone, cold and silent, but carved in purpose. That silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was the presence of something they couldn't touch. Your rebirth. You didn't need to speak to be heard. You didn't need to move to make an impact. You didn't need to prove anything anymore. Because your silence had already done what no scream ever could. Made them afraid. Not of you, but of what you became. They used to look at you and see someone they could manipulate, someone they could use, someone they could ignore when it was convenient. They never expected the silence to last. They thought it was a phase, a wound, a quiet rebellion that would eventually scream for help. But the scream never came. And that's when they realized the silence wasn't temporary. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't healing. It was final. It was your transformation. And oh, how it changed everything. They came back. Of course they did. They always come back when they realize what they've lost. They return with soft apologies, fake smiles, false nostalgia. They say they miss the old you, but the truth is, they miss the control. They miss the version of you that needed them, the version that sought their approval. But that version is buried now, somewhere deep under your silence, and it's not coming back. Because when you walked into the silence, you didn't just disappear. You evolved. You built walls no one can climb. You burned bridges no one can cross. You turned every betrayal into fuel, every rejection into armor, every moment of being underestimated into a silent vow, never again. The silence you walk in now is not emptiness, it is fullness, it is freedom, it is detachment from the noise that once enslaved you. They think silence is passive, but yours is violent. It is cutting, it is final, it is a graveyard for every lie, every insult, every manipulation they ever threw at you. You didn't scream your worth. You didn't fight for their attention. You left. You disappeared into your own world. You shut the door. And that silence, that door, it never opened again. Somewhere, deep down, they thought you'd come crawling back. They believed eventually you'd miss them, that you'd crack under the weight of isolation, that you'd grow desperate enough to call, to reach out, to beg for their attention. But all they ever heard was silence, endless, heavy, echoing. And that's when they realized you turned your silence into permanent. This is your rebirth. You no longer need to be heard. You are no longer begging for understanding. You are no longer explaining your worth to those who chose blindness. You do not exist for their comfort, for their narrative, for their control. You exist now for your own truth, and that truth is louder than any scream. It is colder than any goodbye. It is final. You are not the person they left behind. You are not the person they failed to protect. You are not the victim of their ignorance, their cruelty, their forgetfulness. You are something they can never reach again. Not with apologies, not with explanations, not with regret. Your silence has locked the door to the past, and you threw away the key. This is not about revenge. This is about resurrection. This is about taking everything they thought would destroy you and turning it into the very thing that made you untouchable. They thought your silence meant loss, but it was growth. They thought it meant defeat, but it was strategy. They thought you were broken, but you were building. Now you walk in silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because you don't owe them a single word. They taught you pain. You turned it into discipline. They gave you betrayal. You turned it into boundaries. They offered you silence as abandonment. You transformed it into silence as power. You don't seek revenge. You don't need it. Your absence is the loudest sentence ever spoken. You don't want to be heard anymore. You want to be gone. Not missing, not forgotten. Just unreachable, untouchable, beyond them. And you are. Because when silence becomes permanent, it becomes something more than silence. It becomes legacy. Now, you rise each day, not with noise, but with purpose. You build in secret. You thrive in darkness. You no longer broadcast your pain. You weaponize it. You no longer look outward for light. You became your own fire. The version of you that once waited for rescue no longer exists. You rescued yourself, you saved yourself, and they'll never know how. Because they're not meant to. Because your silence is no longer a cry. It's a wall. It's a gate. It's final. Let them wonder. Let them regret. Let them miss the version of you they destroyed. Because that version was soft. That version was forgiving. That version believed in people who never deserved it. But now there's only silence. The kind that echoes. The kind that haunts. The kind that teaches them a lesson far more brutal than words ever could. You didn't disappear. You evolved. You ascended. You became something unrecognizable to those who tried to define you. They used to say you changed. They're right. But they'll never understand what you changed into, because they never stayed long enough to deserve the answer. They walked out before the transformation. Now they want back in, but all they find is silence, and they'll never know if it means peace or if it means war. That's your gift to them, uncertainty. That's your revenge, disappearance. That's your power, permanence. They called it silence. But it was always strategy. It was always your rebirth. And now, it is your legacy. You turned your silence into permanent. They will say they remember you, but they only remember the version they could manipulate. The one that stayed quiet out of fear, not power. The one that tolerated the weight of others just to keep the peace. But peace wasn't peace. It was suppression. It was the slow drowning of your soul while you smiled for everyone else's comfort. You weren't silent because you didn't know what to say. You were silent because no one was listening. And when no one listens long enough, the fire inside doesn't die. It just stops burning for them. Now you burn alone, quietly, relentlessly. You fuel yourself, and there is nothing more dangerous than a soul no longer waiting to be understood. They never knew what you were building in the dark. They never asked. They never cared. But the darkness became your forge. Your silence became your anvil. And every hour spent alone became a strike of the hammer, shaping you into something no one saw coming. You didn't announce your comeback. You didn't post your progress. You simply disappeared and let the silence grow roots. They'll call you cold. Let them. They don't understand the cost of warmth. They don't know the price you pay just to be heard, just to be loved, just to belong. But you learn the truth. Some places aren't worth returning to. Some people aren't worth reopening for. Some silences aren't meant to be broken. They're meant to be eternal. You didn't shut them out of spite. You shut them out because you finally saw the truth. They were never doors. They were cages. And you don't owe cages your explanation. You don't owe your jailers a farewell. Your silence is not absence. It is resistance. It is rebellion. It is the sound of someone who no longer needs to explain themselves, and they hate it because silence forces them to confront what they did. Silence is the mirror they can't look into without guilt clawing at their conscience. Words can be argued with. Silence leaves them alone with themselves, and that's more terrifying than anything you could ever say. Let them wonder if you hate them. Let them wonder if you miss them. Let them drown in the mystery of the silence they created. You don't owe them clarity. You owe yourself peace. And this silence, it is peace. Not the kind found in hugs and forgiveness, but the kind forged in loneliness, in discipline, in utter detachment from their chaos. You walked away, fully, finally, quietly, not because you were weak, but because you were done wasting your voice on those who would never hear you. Because some messages aren't meant to be spoken. Some are meant to be felt, and they will feel it. Every time they scroll past your name and see nothing. Every time they reach out and hear no reply. Every time they revisit memories and realize the door they took for granted is gone, sealed, silent, and eternal. They underestimated you because they mistook your kindness for permission, your patience for passivity, your silence for surrender. But you were never surrendering. You were watching. You were learning. You were outgrowing. And now that you've grown beyond them, they can no longer follow. They can only watch, from the outside, in the dark, wondering how the silence became your kingdom and their prison. You no longer fight battles that drain you. You no longer defend your heart to the undeserving. You no longer explain your silence. You let it speak, loudly, eternally. They will remember you, but not as the one they hurt, not as the one they left behind. They will remember the one who disappeared so completely. They question whether they ever knew you at all. That's your power. That's your triumph. You didn't scream. You didn't fight. You left. And in that leaving, you became more than you ever were. Not for them, but for yourself. You are no longer waiting for apologies. You are no longer waiting to be understood. You are no longer reaching toward closed hands. Your silence is not a pause. It is not anticipation. It is conclusion. It is the end of the story they were writing without your consent, and the beginning of the one you write. In fire and steel and unbreakable solitude, they thought you were the echo, but you were the mountain. They thought you were the absence, but you were the storm before the flood. They thought you were waiting, but you were already gone. And now they speak your name like a question, but you've become an answer they'll never earn. Because you turned your silence into something they never saw coming, into something they'll never escape, into something permanent. The world will try to label what it cannot understand. They will call you heartless. They will say you're bitter, cold, unreachable. But you've heard it all before, haven't you? You've lived through their narratives. You let them name you things you never were. You let them assign meaning to your silence, your distance, your healing, You tolerated their ignorance because you once believed it was your burden to explain yourself. But not anymore. Not now. Now, your silence has become something so sharp, so defined, so absolute, that no label fits it. It's not detachment, it's clarity. It's not anger, it's ascension. You no longer seek to be understood. Understanding is currency for the desperate, and you are no longer desperate. You've withdrawn the final piece of yourself from the table. There are no more words, no more invitations, no more access. They never realized that silence is the final boundary. Louder than goodbye, stronger than closure, more permanent than any revenge. Silence says, I'm done explaining. Silence says, you no longer get to know me. And that terrifies them, because now the story is theirs to carry, not yours. They replay the last conversation over and over, hoping for a clue, a thread, a weakness. But all they find is stillness. All they hear is that permanent dead-end quiet, the one they earned. And they'll call you heartless. But they don't know the nights you cried into the void, alone. They don't know the wars you fought within, the ones you never let spill out because no one ever truly listened. They don't know how many times you chose peace over pride, forgiveness over fire, compassion over retaliation, until finally, your compassion ran out. You didn't become cruel. You became empty of tolerance. You didn't turn cold. You stopped burning for people who only ever watched you freeze. And now, they miss the fire they never protected. You walk in silence now, not because you're hiding, but because you've outgrown the noise, the need to respond, to react, to explain. You no longer lower yourself into rooms filled with chaos just to be seen. You don't need the stage. You don't need the microphone. You are your own audience now, and you've heard enough. What you're building in this silence, they will never see. What you're becoming, they will never touch. You're not rebuilding yourself for revenge. You're building something sacred, private, permanent. Your silence is the sacred space where you finally met yourself, unfiltered, undefeated, and unbothered. They think you disappeared, but really, you've just stopped performing. They miss the version of you that danced for their validation, the version that over-explained, overgave, overloved. But that version didn't survive the silence. That version was buried beneath the weight of betrayal, disappointment, and abandonment. And what rose in its place? Someone untouchable, someone dangerous, someone permanent. They will try to come back. They always do. They'll knock on doors they once slammed. They'll try to unburn bridges they set fire to. But you're not on the other side anymore. You've moved on, moved higher, moved inward. And now, silence answers when they call. Not bitterness, not hate, just absence. Complete and unapologetic absence. And absence hurts. It forces them to feel what they once made you live through. To sit in the space where you used to be, where your love used to be, your laughter, your warmth. But now it's just silence, and the silence doesn't lie. It tells them everything they never wanted to hear. That you're gone. That you're no longer reachable. That this time, the silence isn't a pause, it's a tomb. You are not angry anymore. Anger is for those still seeking justice. You're not seeking anything. You've become the ending. That's what silence gave you. Closure without permission. Peace without approval. Power without needing revenge. They used to think they could always return, but now they stand outside your silence like beggars, at a door that no longer exists. And that is the true power of transformation. Not in yelling, not in fighting, not in proving, but in disappearing. In choosing yourself so completely that no one else's noise reaches you. That's what you've done. That's what your silence has become. Not passive, not empty, but total, final, forever. They never expected your silence would become permanent, because they never expected you to stop needing them. They never thought you would stop waiting, stop hurting, stop answering, but you did. And now, the silence speaks for you. It doesn't just echo, it punishes. Not with cruelty, but with truth. The truth that you never needed them to understand you. You only needed yourself to finally believe you are enough to walk away. And now that you have, there is nothing left for them, not a word, not a whisper, only silence. And that silence is eternal. They'll scroll through old messages, rereading the fragments you left behind, hoping to find a loophole in your silence, but there is none. You weren't vague, you were exhausted, you weren't confused, you were done. They don't get it, because they only understand finality when it comes with fury, with flames, with the scream that fills the air and begs for resolution. But you gave them none of that. You gave them silence, and in that silence, you buried every last chance they ever had. Now they speak of you in past tense, as if you died, as if you faded, but you're not dead. You're just out of reach. That version of you, the open one, the soft one, the one who waited and hoped and believed even when everything screamed otherwise, that version is gone. And what remains isn't a ghost. It's a fortress, made of scars, bound by solitude, guarded by silence. You are still here, but not for them. You are here for the version of you that survived them. You are here for the quiet warrior that chose to endure instead of retaliate, for the fire that refused to be extinguished even when no one saw it burning. They don't get to see you now, not the real you, not the aftermath of your evolution, not the storm you became when the world turned away. They watched you fall and turn their back. They thought you would stay broken, that you would return to them the same, but you didn't come back. You rose higher than they ever thought you could, and you did it without them. That's why the silence hurts, because it's not passive, it's proof. Proof that you never needed them to begin with. Proof that their absence only cleared space for your own presence to expand, and now you're everywhere they can't touch. They whisper your name in conversations that trail off, always ending with, "I wonder what happened." But deep down, they know. They know what they did. They know what they didn't do. They know what they allowed, what they ignored, what they failed to protect. Your silence is the verdict. It is the truth they run from, the mirror they cannot shatter. It's not you haunting them. It's their own reflection in the silence you left behind. And still, you do not speak. You do not explain, because silence is the greatest clarity. It removes the fantasy, the excuses, the justifications. There are no edits, no rewrites, no second chances in silence. There is only what was, and the reality of what will never be again. They may try to rebuild the path back to you, piece by piece, but they'll find the road is gone, washed away by the tide of your becoming, because what was once an open door has been sealed shut by time, by pain, by the decision to protect your peace above all else. And no key fits now, not apologies, not time, not even love, because silence, once made permanent, is a boundary written in stone. It doesn't waver, it doesn't blink, it doesn't bend, it is. And in that immovable silence, you found something they never offered. Freedom. You no longer live for the validation of others. You no longer bleed for temporary hands. You no longer speak just to be heard. You speak only when it matters, and only to those who've earned your voice. Everyone else, they get silence, not out of pettiness, but out of purity, out of respect for your own growth. Because once you realize what your peace costs, you no longer bargain it away for the sake of familiarity. You no longer give explanations to those who had their chance to understand you and chose not to. You no longer hope to be seen by eyes that were always closed. You simply leave. And in that leaving, you rise. You rise in the quiet hours where no one watches. You rise in the shadows where no one claps. You rise in the void where their absence used to sting, but no longer does. Because your silence has healed you. It has armored you. It has made you whole.